Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. The man who says Alberta needs a new premier, Brian Jean, is back with the UCP after winning a by-election in Fort McMurray. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made another appeal for a no-fly zone, this time to the U.S. Congress. And a tournament in Lethbridge is underway to see who's the best arm wrestler. BCN's Micah Quinn has the details.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Brian Jean, the former leader of the Wildrose Party in Alberta, won a by-election in Fort McMurray, Lac-La-Biche on Tuesday night, capturing close to 64% of the votes. Jean beat out the Alberta Wildrose Independence Party leader, Paul Hinman, and the NDP candidate, Ariana Mancini. Jean, who has been a staunch critic of Premier Jason Kenney, says it's time for a change. He says the UCP needs to vote for a new leader at the party's annual general meeting coming up April 9th in Red Deer.
We have lost faith in politics at every level. We've seen a failure in leadership at the federal party. We've seen a failure in leadership at the provincial level. My friends, enough is enough. Please join me, join Albertans, as we take back our province on April 9th, and join me in Red Deer, Alberta, so we can have our say in the SGM about the leadership we've received from Jason Kenney. My friends, it's not good enough. And the things that are facing us are bigger and worse than I've ever expected coming.
Premier Kenney, who congratulated Jean on social media, says he will remain on as leader if he receives 50 plus 1% of the vote next month. Now, of note, former Conservative leaders Ed Stelmach and Alison Redford both received 77% approval ratings shortly before each party stepped down. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson says with Brian Jean back in the fold, it could create some serious issues for Premier Jason Kenney.
And Brian Jean has not pulled very many punches over the past 6 months or so. He's called for Kenney to resign. He wants to be the Premier of Alberta. So he's going to be a huge thorn in the side of Jason Kenney if he stays in caucus. The question is whether or not he's going to stay in caucus and for how long, because of course in a month's time we have this leadership review of Kenney coming up.
Tyler Dawson will have more on what that means for Brian Jean being back with the UCP. That's coming up after business news. Premier Kenney was asked by reporters if he still supports Albertans wearing masks, even though the mask mandate has been dropped by the province. Kenney says what we need to do is depoliticize the issue and simply respect one another.
It's up to each individual to assess their own risk profile, and we respect the choices that people make. I would just say that there should be no stigma around masks. Masks should not be seen as some kind of a personal statement or a political statement. They should just be a choice that people choose to make if they believe it's appropriate. I can certainly understand, for example, why people who might be immunocompromised or have other unique risk factors might feel it's more, or they're working in very close circumstances with others in poor ventilation. There might very well be circumstances where people will think it's better to wear a mask. And I would just, if that's the case, I encourage them to do so. But I would really like us to depoliticize all of this. You know, when we had mask mandates, there were some people that refused to wear the masks as some kind of a political statement, and now I hear others saying they will just because they're upset that there isn't a mask mandate. You know, I really hope that we can. There's been too much division throughout the COVID era. I hope we can leave that behind us and just respect individual choice.
The federal government announced that as of April 1st, most travelers entering Canada will no longer have to show proof of a negative COVID-19 test. Ottawa will be lifting the pre-arrival COVID-19 testing requirement at the border for travelers who are fully vaccinated. Officials say passengers may be subjected to random PCR testing at the airport, and travelers will still have to use the Arrive Can app when arriving into Canada. Federal Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino announced new measures aimed at tackling gun violence here in Canada. Mendicino says action needs to be taken now to prevent so many guns from crossing our borders.
We're reinforcing our borders to stop illegal guns from getting into the country. We've banned deadly firearms to prevent them from getting into the hands of criminals. And we're building safer communities. Our plan is well underway. At our borders, our government has invested significant federal funding to give RCMP and CBSA the tools and the resources that they need to fight illegal gun smuggling and to stop firearms from coming into Canada.
Fresh after speaking with parliamentarians in Ottawa, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky appealed to the U.S. Congress, asking for more help in his country's fight against Russia. Zelensky, through an interpreter, said, "We need you right now."
Right now, the destiny of our country is being decided. The destiny of our people, whether Ukrainians will be free, whether they will be able to preserve their democracy. Russia has attacked not just us, not just our land, not just our cities. It went on a brutal offensive against our values, basic human values. It threw tanks and planes against our freedom, against our right to live freely in our own country, choosing our own future. This is a terror that Europe has not seen for 80 years, and we are asking for a reply, for an answer to this terror from the whole world. Is this a lot to ask for, to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine to save people? Is this too much to ask? Humanitarian no-fly zone, something that that Russia would not be able to terrorize our free cities.
The prime ministers of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovenia traveled by train to Kyiv to meet with Ukrainian President Zelensky in a show of support for Ukraine.
This invasion has to stop. The blood on the street, your mothers, your children, your wives are safe, but those who are killed by Putin, they can never be forgotten, and they are not forgotten.
Civilians continue to be evacuated from the Ukrainian city of Sumy. It's part of an ongoing operation by the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Ukrainian Red Cross Society.
We have people, civilians in the hundreds trying to load these buses, and we would try to escort this convoy across the lines and bring them back into some kind of safety.
The United Nations says around 3 million refugees have now fled Ukraine since the war with Russia began around 3 weeks ago. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, met with defense ministers from a number of European nations to discuss the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how to best protect NATO nations should the war with Russia escalate even further.
We have already activated our defense plans to shield the alliance, increase our readiness, and deploy troops from both sides of the Atlantic. There are now hundreds of thousands of forces at heightened alert across the alliance, 100,000 US troops in Europe, and around 40,000 troops under direct NATO command, mostly in the eastern part of the alliance.
A Lethbridge group is asking for some much-needed donations for the people of Ukraine who are struggling as the war with Russia rages on. The group, calling itself Lethbridge Assistance for Ukraine, is asking for medication and medical supplies that will be shipped to Ukraine.
Most of the medical supplies that we're looking for are for dealing with wounds, like probably pretty traumatic wounds, tourniquets, big bandages that could be used, like sterile big bandages that can be used to deal with a lot of bleeding. Medication could be mostly in tablet form, so like Imodium, Gravol, ibuprofen, and like Tylenol.
You can drop off donations to the Holy Trinity Ukrainian Orthodox Church here in Lethbridge, and a volunteer will be able to help you unload every Wednesday and Sunday. Alberta RCMP have laid more charges in connection with the Coutts border protest. 36-year-old James Edward Sowery of Flagstaff County, Alberta, was arrested and charged with assault with a weapon and dangerous operation of a vehicle. Police say following a road stop on February the 14th, Sowery accelerated his commercial vehicle and almost hit a few officers. He was released and will appear in Lethbridge Court on March the 28th. Police have also charged 62-year-old Joanne Lynn Person of Coutts with dangerous operation of a vehicle. person will appear in court on March 23rd. Students from the Kenney Nation had the chance to learn all about what Lethbridge College's wind turbine program has to offer. As Angela Stewart explains now, a prospective student who attended says once he joined the program, he hopes to become a good example for other people on his reserve.
This is actually kind of interesting. I'm actually glad I got to come.
It was a jam-packed day for these prospective students from the Kenney Nation and other Indigenous communities around southern Alberta when they had the chance to learn about what it takes to be a wind turbine technician.
In one of the middle part, we got to go inside, look at all the stuff that's all inside. I got to climb through it and even got to put on the VR.
Braxton Wells, a 17-year-old student from the Kenney Nation, says his interest in the program came from wanting to conquer a fear.
I'm kind of scared of heights, so that's one of my fears I want to kind of build up. So I kind of want to go into turbines because they're high up in the air.
More importantly for Wells, joining the college's program would allow him to be a shining example for others.
I just want people young someone my age, at least have a good life, because on our reserve there's a lot of people that kind of chose the wrong path and they're going down the wrong path. I kind of just want people my age to go enjoy life and do stuff with their life and move on and not just be in one spot in one place.
The reason we do it is to get the kids interested, to give them a career.
Thanks to a partnership with NL Green Power and the college, more opportunities are offered to Indigenous students who are interested in the profession.
And just seeing the kids there, walking through and looking at things, they're overwhelmed, because it is an overwhelming thing to see and to understand, okay, this nacelle that we're standing in, it's going to be 200, 300 feet in the air, and it's overwhelming for them. It can be frightening, but it's exciting as well, right?
The program at the college is a one-year diploma program, and studies get underway in September. For Bridge City News, I'm Angela Stewart.
That looks pretty cool. Last year, Lethbridge City Council approved a series of recommendations in response to the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Now, one of those recommendations included strategic planning around Indigenous purchasing and procurement. The Economic Standing Policy Committee met today, and BCN's Naveen Day was in attendance. Now, Nav, you say the recommendation for Indigenous purchasing has since been expanded. How did the committee respond to the motion to file?
Well, Hal, the motion to file the benefits-driven procurement strategy update was defeated 4-4. The report proposed that the scope to procure be expanded to look through a social and benefits-driven analysis of purchasing from Indigenous, local, and social groups. Acting Mayor Rayco Dodick expressed concerns that the recommendation had an agenda to push economic affirmative action. And Councillor John Middleton Hope felt that this type of procurement process would give a leg up to Indigenous and special interest groups. He says there should be a level playing field in the procurement process. The report, which was compiled by speaking with over 120 stakeholders, was conducted by research firm By Social Canada. The cost for the research was close to $60,000. For Bridge City News, I'm Naveen Day.
Thanks so much, Nav. That was BCN video journalist Naveen Day reporting from Lethbridge City Hall. After nearly two-week road trip, the Lethbridge Hurricanes are back in action at the NMAC Centre. As BCN's Nathan Ryder reports, the team is in the thick of an intense playoff battle in the WHL's Eastern Conference.
After 2 weeks on the road against Eastern Conference opponents, the Lethbridge Hurricanes are back home at the NMAC Centre. Over the course of the 7-game road trip, the Canes posted a record of 3-3-1, collecting 7 of 14 possible points. Canes head coach Brent Kissio says his team has a lot of unfinished business.
We just came off that long road trip, and it's time for us to play at home and play around here, but we have a hard schedule still. We got a lot of good hockey to play against a lot of good teams, and it won't be easy. But our goal is to make playoffs, and then once you get a playoffs, anything can happen. The Hurricanes currently sit 7th in the Western Hockey League's Eastern Conference. The league changed the format from previous years so the top 8 teams from each conference qualify instead of the top 3 teams in each division plus 2 wildcards. There are 5 teams currently within 5 points battling for the final 2 playoff spots in the Eastern Conference. Kissio says it's an exciting time for the Hurricanes. I mean, this building rocking again. We're playing some great hockey down the stretch. We're already in playoff hockey mode right now, so it should be a fun atmosphere again, and we're excited to be back home. The 2-week road trip provided a chance for the Canes to develop some team chemistry. Forward and co-captain Jet Jones says the trip was good for the Canes to bond before a key stretch.
Spending 13 days, I think it was, with all the guys, having lots of laughs with them, being on the bus with them, it brings us together. And right now, for the next little while here. We got to be a good team. We need everybody going. So I think that was really good for us.
For Bridge City News, I'm Nathan Ryder.
Strong men here in Lethbridge are set to battle in a test of arm strength this weekend. The Lethbridge Arm Wrestling Club is hosting a tournament to see who has the strongest arm here in our city. As BCN's Micah Quinn reports now, this will be the second annual event held here in the Windy City.
The Lethbridge Arm Wrestling Club has been going strong for close to 40 years, and Len Houghton has been honing his craft during those 4 decades. He says there will be arm wrestlers coming from Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Manitoba, and potentially even a few from Montana who will make the trek to the Windy City for the second annual Lethbridge Arm Wrestling Club's Classic Tournament. Houghton is no stranger to titles within the sport of arm wrestling.
Yeah, I got 16 Canadian super heavyweight national titles. I got 4 Canadian wrist wrestling national titles. I think I got a sit-down national title, 2 world championships, 2 silvers, 3 bronze in the worlds. I think I've been to 11 world championships.
Club member Mike Schaff says there are quite a few rules within the arm wrestling game, but first and foremost, etiquette is vital.
You know, you're shaking hands. That's the thing with arm wrestling is that you can almost hate each other, and you get up to the table, you do your thing, you leave, and you're good buddies after. It's all just trying to get in each other's head.
Judd McNabb started arm wrestling 3 years ago, and he says there are quite a few techniques to use when you're competing.
Top rolling, standing on the outside. It's a lot safer too, right? You don't put your body into it as much. You have an escape route if you start losing. You know, your arm can go down to the pin line quite easily. So, you know, you kind of save yourself from injuries and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of a good starting point as a top roll. Starting to get into inside pulling now, just building that strength, so definitely starting to do it now.
The arm wrestling tournament will take place at 12 p.m. on March 19th at the Rocky Mountain Turf Club. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
From the Briar and curling to arm wrestling tournaments, why not? Good to see here in our city. Well, the spring-like temperatures continued for much of southwestern Alberta, and those milder temperatures will be sticking around for quite some time. Full weather details are on deck. You know, it was another great day for taking your bike out for a ride at Henderson Lake, or maybe your dog for a run here in Lethbridge, as we saw close to 10 degrees once again today. Tonight, there's a 30% of showers developing with a low near 0. Thursday, mainly sunny with a high expected near 12 degrees. Friday, lots of sunshine again with a high near 10. Even warmer on Saturday with a high of 13 degrees. Sunday, cooling off slightly under a partly cloudy sky with a high near 7. Monday, a mixture of sun and cloud and a high of 12. Even warmer on Tuesday with a high of 15 degrees. Now checking the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 6 degrees and an average low of -7. The highest temperature in this state was recorded in 1985 at 19 degrees, and the record low a very chilly -33 in 1943. The sun rose at 7:43 and set at 7:37. Let's see how Thursday is shaping up across the country now. Expect periods of rain and a high of 9 degrees in Victoria, rain and 7 for Vancouver. Just a few clouds and 7 degrees as well for Edmonton. Mainly sunny and 11 for Calgary on Thursday. Clearing and 5 degrees for Regina. Mainly sunny and 3 degrees for Saskatoon. Expect light flurries and +1 for Winnipeg on Thursday. In the central part of the country, it'll be partly cloudy and 17 degrees in Toronto. Overcast and 14 in Ottawa. A mixture of sun and cloud and 15 degrees for Montreal. In Atlantic Canada, there's a slight chance of showers developing and a high of 12 for Fredericton. Mainly cloudy and 8 degrees in Halifax. A chance of showers and 8 degrees as well for Charlottetown. And in St. John's, expect lots of cloud cover and a high near 3 degrees on Thursday. Inflation went up again. It's now at a 31-year high at 5.7%. It was just 5.1% back in January. Stats Canada says on a monthly basis, prices have risen by 1% in February. Analysts say with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, commodity prices will continue to rise. Federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh is calling on the Trudeau Liberals to address the rising cost of living. He says excessive profits must be curbed and the money reinvested in families.
That our government shouldn't allow this to happen and sit back and say we can't do anything about it. We don't accept that. We've got significant tools. We've got the tax code. We've got federal laws on competition. There are significant powers we have to stop this, to say no. Large corporations shouldn't be profiting off of a war and a pandemic, and working class families shouldn't have to suffer or struggle because of it.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced new funding to support the retooling of an Ontario Honda plant to enable the production of hybrid electric vehicles. Trudeau says the investment will come from both Ottawa and the Ontario government.
The federal government is making a $131.6 million contribution as part of Honda Canada's nearly $1.4 billion investment. This will support thousands of jobs here at Honda in Alliston, but thousands more jobs in the local economy and across the Canadian supply chain. It means clean, affordable vehicles for Canadians, but also cleaner air for us all and for future generations in our communities.
Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 280 points on the day to finish at 21,468. The Dow was up 518 points to 34,063. The S&P 500 was up 95 points to 4357, and the Nasdaq was up 487 points on the day to 13,436. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down $1.38 to 95.07 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 19 cents to 4.76 US. Gold was up 8.52 to 19.2646 US an ounce, and silver was even on the day at 25.09 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $12.92 per bushel, barley's at $9.79, canola's at $25.28, and corn is at $11.68 per bushel. Live cattle were down $1.50 to $139.35. Feeder cattle were up 90 cents to $157.25, and lean hogs were down 3 cents to $102.38. The Canadian dollar was even over the past 24 hours at 78.88 US. Recapping one of our top stories, Brian Jean, the former leader of the Wildrose Party in Alberta, won a by-election in Fort McMurray, Lac-La-Biche on Tuesday night, capturing close to 64% of the votes. Jean beat out the Alberta Wildrose Independence Party leader Paul Hinman and the NDP candidate Ariana Mancini. Jean, who's been a staunch critic of Premier Jason Kenney, says it's time for a change. He says he will be pushing for that change at the UCP Leadership Review April 9th in Red Deer. The Alberta government announced millions of dollars in new spending with the recent budget, including more help for students. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will have details for us in just a moment.
Here's today's Bridge City News Community Calendar. The Lethbridge Symphony Orchestra is celebrating their 60th anniversary with a performance of a special selection of memorable movie music from the past 60 years. Here's some of the most popular theme music from The Godfather, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and so much more. This special presentation is taking place Monday, March 21st at the Southminster United Church, with doors opening at 7 p.m. To purchase tickets and for more information, visit lethbridgesymphony.org. Come out for some family fun at Easter at the Galt, taking place Saturday, April 16th from 10 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Enjoy exciting performances by Lethbridge's Troyanda Ukrainian Dance Club. Challenge your family to an epic egg battle and explore the Galt as you hunt for Easter eggs. Cost for admission is $6 per person and free for annual pass holders. Spots are limited, so book early by going to galtmuseum.com. And that's your Bridge City News Community Calendar.
Brian Jean is back. The former leader of the Wildrose Party won a by-election in Fort McMurray, Lac-La-Biche with a close one. Actually, it wasn't that close at all. 64% of the vote. He received congratulations on social media from Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. But how happy is Kenney really, considering that Jean says the UCP needs a leadership change? To talk about this in more detail is Tyler Dawson, the Alberta correspondent with the National Post and our legislative reporter. Tyler, some political pundits are saying if Jean makes waves right away, he may be punted from caucus and will have to sit as an independent.
It's definitely a possibility. You know, the UCP has been a pretty broad tent and pretty tolerant of dissent so far. But there is a line, of course. You know, Leela Ahir lost a cabinet post over calling for Kenney to resign. There are two people sitting as independents at the moment, Todd Lowen and Drew Barnes, who were booted from caucus for being too critical of Jason Kenney. And Brian Jean has not pulled very many punches over the past 6 months or so. He's called for Kenney to resign. He wants to be the Premier of Alberta. So he's going to be a huge thorn in the side of Jason Kenney if he stays in caucus. The question is whether or not he's going to stay in caucus and for how long, because of course in a month's time we have this leadership review of Kenney coming up. The other factor that's at play here a little bit is at a certain point, an independent caucus in the legislature becomes its own caucus, which means that it will get its own research budget and things like that. And that's when you can really start having these sort of independent MLAs cause problems because they just have more resources. So that's very much something that the United Conservative leadership, the Premier's office, they want to avoid that. They don't want this, independent group of troublemakers basically to have, resources and get that many questions and the opportunities in committee, all these sorts of things that can cause them trouble. So there's going to be a lot of wrangling, I think, to watch in the next month or two on where exactly Brian Jean fits into this system. Who knows? Maybe after the leadership review, they'll all decide to play nice and focus on winning the election next year. I think that is actually another possible option. Well, let's talk about that leadership review in Red Deer, April the 9th. How many fireworks do you think we'll see? I mean, Premier Kenney has his supporters, but so does Brian Jean. Yeah, and there does seem to have been some sort of background work being done across the province, trying to organize people to come, trying to perhaps offer some money for people to come, because of course there is a fee associated with attending the special general meeting. I don't actually know what to expect, if I'm being perfectly honest, because it is sort of a mini convention. There's like a dinner on the Friday night for some of the constituency association presidents. The voting is on Saturday, and at some point late Saturday, we should know the outcome of that. It's not going to be sort of 2 weeks down the line that we find this out. So, but it's in Red Deer, which is obviously very, very central for the people of Edmonton and Calgary. But, if you're coming from Grand Prairie or Lac La Biche or even Lethbridge, it's a little bit of a hike for these people. So how many people are going to show up is a big question. And, the other strange thing, maybe not strange, but remarkable, is Premier Jason Kenney has said he's looking for 50+1 of the vote. 51%, he's got the confidence of the United Conservative Party, which is true, I suppose. But, historically speaking, leaders have often looked for higher numbers than that, mid-60s, mid-70s as sort of the benchmark they're trying to reach. So even if he wins that, just how tight is his hold on the party is going to be something else to watch. Long-winded way of me saying, I don't know if I expect too many fireworks per se, but I do think there'll be a lot of stuff going on in the shadows in the next month or so. And then even if Jason Kenney wins that day, the trouble's not over. And if he loses, obviously they're going into a leadership race. So lots of sort of possible paths the future this thing can go, I think. And what's interesting as well, Tyler, a recent poll by Think HQ said 61% of Albertans want a new premier, but as we know, only party members get a chance to vote in the leadership review. Yeah, and that polling actually also showed that something like 59%, I think, of people who voted United Conservative last time also think there needs to be a new leader. So, hard to say, I guess, whether or not people who voted UCP last time translate into party members. But, people could be signing up, getting a party membership if they feel that strongly. And, it's early days, too, I should note, in this sort of economic boom sort of thing we seem to be in at the moment, and I had a source tell me at the last convention that, $100 barrel of oil plasters over a lot of problems for Jason Kenney. And I think that's true. It could be true in the next year when we go to the polls, but is that going to be enough by April 9th? That's a little bit harder to say, I think. Premier Kenney was in Lethbridge recently and I had a chance to chat with him, and I asked him specifically, will we be receiving any, like Ralph Klein when we had those dividend checks, $300 for every man, woman, and child? Now that, there's a balanced book, so to speak, right now, we're back in the black. And he says, as long as we can completely pay down the debt, which is in about 2 years, then you'll see some Kenney cash, as he put it. So I thought that was interesting. Now let's circle back to the by-election in Fort McMurray for a second here, Tyler. It was a bit of a surprise that the leader of the Alberta Wildrose Independence Party, Paul Hinman, only got, 628 votes? That was less than the NDP candidate, Ariana Mancini, received over 1,000. Do you think Hinman will maybe step down as leader? I don't know if he'll stand down as leader. It's a little bit of a question, I think, in some of these small parties, how much the party is the leader, and whether or not the party sort of has the infrastructure to come up with someone new. But honestly, totally shocking, I thought. I didn't expect Paul Hinman to win. In spite of all the noise we hear about independence parties, they don't tend to perform that well in elections. But in the heart of oil country, to have the new Democrat candidate Not that the New Democrats in Alberta aren't fairly supportive of oil and gas, but it's just a strange scenario where you'd have the NDP candidate doing better than Paul Hinman, who's been around for a long time as a sort of a known name in Alberta politics as a former Wildroser back, when the Wildrose Party was not the Wildrose Independence Party, I should say. But it does sort of go to show a little bit, how much legs some of this stuff has. He's been really, really vocal about some of the COVID restrictions and bringing those down, equalization, all of these other issues. And, people talk about independence, they make a splash, the media covers independent stuff whenever it comes up. But when you look at on the ground, when the votes are counted, they're just not that effective. And so I think that was very interesting. And you're right, it will be interesting to see what happens with that party in the year ahead going into the next election.
I think about some of the federal parties too, the independent parties, like the Maverick Party as well. And the PPC is not really an independence party, but they didn't get any seats either. So you're right, it seems like people seem to go with more the main parties when it comes to elections, federally and provincially. Now, Tyler, the province announced as part of Budget 2022 that $72 million will go towards charter schools. Now, can you explain what kind of schools these are and what the funding will go towards?
Sure, and I had to look it up. I don't have children myself, so, a lot of this education stuff is just, peripheral to me. So charter school, they are sort of quasi-public schools. They don't report to a public school board. They report directly to the province, and they tend to focus on specific things such as music or focus on science, things like that. Not quite the same as a private school, such as a religious private school or something like that, but not a fully public school either. And so this money is sort of to go to capital costs and operating costs. There apparently hasn't been sort of sustainable usual funding for charter schools, the government says. So that's what this money will sort of help establish. I think there's about 16 of them around the province, 15 or 16. Compared to obviously the much larger public school system. So the people that run the charter schools are obviously very, very happy about this, to have this funding, and the people in the public school system, are obviously saying that they'd prefer the money go to the public school system. So it's part of this sort of choice in education thing the United Conservatives have going for them, that they talk about, whether that's homeschooling or charter schools, just providing more options, I guess, to parents who are concerned about the public school system or would prefer their children be educated somewhere else. So, just part of this larger spending of money that money we suddenly have.
It appears as though the UCP made a rash of budget-related spending announcements, and among them, Tyler, an increase from $2 to $5 million to improve security for religious groups such as churches and charities at risk of violence or hate crimes. Tell me more about that.
So this is funding basically that was announced last summer. The $2 million was announced last summer. And yeah, it's for security or surveillance cameras, things of that nature, to protect institutions at risk of hate crimes or vandalism, things like that. Of course, we saw a rash of arsons at churches last summer or late spring, I guess, maybe. So it sort of came out in the wake of that sort of stuff. But because of good money in the budget, lots of revenue, that's gone up to $5 million. So that fund will have even more money in it available to the people who wish to access it. So as you mentioned, just part of this, every leader, every party does like a grand tour after a good budget to announce new funding. And that's just one of the ones that stuck out this week to me as a little bit notable.
Now, I don't know about you, but every time I go to the pump right now, it seems like I'm in shock. I'm stunned and I need therapy after filling up at the pumps right now. It's just incredible. The price of gas that we're paying, I think in Lethbridge right now, we're about $1.60. What are you at in Edmonton right now?
A little bit higher than that, about $1.65. So not totally wild, but certainly the most expensive I've ever seen it.
Now, but fortunately, we will be receiving a break of about 13 cents a litre, with the UCP holding back the provincial fuel tax. But there's a bit of a catch, and what is that?
Well, it's graded. So if oil is below $80 a barrel, there's no fuel tax break. If it goes above 80, it sort of it drops by X number of cents per dollar, I guess, of price on a barrel of oil. So of course, where oil is at right now, I think it was about 97 or 98 dollars on Wednesday. The fuel tax is going to drop. Now this is on gasoline and diesel. It's not on aviation fuel or something like that, if that's what you were hoping to stock up on. And it should, I guess you could look at it either way. It either saves Albertans about $1.3 billion a year, or it's going to cost the government about $1.3 billion a year. At any rate, that's the number that's in the budget for what the fuel tax is each year. So a little bit of relief, of course. At the same time, the carbon tax is going up to 3 cents to about 11 cents a liter. So, balances the scales a little bit there, maybe, at a time when oil and gas prices are, on one hand, very good for the government, and on the other hand, a little bit inconvenient for people at the gas pump. So we should see some relief there in the coming weeks ahead. Who knows what gas will look like at that point, though, and how much that 13 cents is going to help.
Yeah, that takes effect on April the 1st. Tyler, the NDP attempted to get a permanent ban on coal mining in the eastern slopes of the Rockies with a private member's bill introduced by Rachel Notley, but it was promptly shot down.
Yeah, so we've talked about this a couple times, I think. This goes back to this 1976 policy on banning basically coal mining on the eastern slopes. The UCP 2 years ago suddenly revoked this, and there were going to be exploration and projects going ahead. There was pretty significant backlash from small towns and mayors in southern Alberta. And the UCP sort of backtracked on that. They asked for a study, an independent study that was done. The results of that are back. The recommendation was essentially the 1976 policy go back into effect, which has happened. So that's the situation right now. The UCP is going to look at sort of further modifications to the rules around coal mining on the eastern slope. So there's a handful of projects that are still in like the early phases that are going to continue to be analyzed and sort of go ahead, but a lot of further stuff possibly being shut down. What the NDP wants is a legislative ban on coal mining on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. They say basically that what Energy Minister Sonia Savage did in going back to the 1976 policy is basically a ministerial order. She could, in theory, revoke that at any time. So they want this to be legislated. The UCP, in order for this to have gone straight to second reading in the legislature, there needed to be unanimous consent on the bill. That did not happen. So now it goes back to sort of a committee that evaluates all private members' bills. It's a long-winded way of me saying there's this legislative wrangling on the coal policy. There's this, small town Alberta political wrangling on the coal policy. At the moment, we're back to where we were 2 years ago or so, with more to come on it, no doubt about that. And this is a thing that I think we're going to continue to hear a lot about in the months ahead, because it's such a big deal, for southern Alberta and small towns in southern Alberta, and also for environmentalists in the city. So it has these very interesting sort of bipartisan urban-rural alliances and stuff like that make it a very, very interesting topic in Alberta politics right now.
Tyler, we are going to have an exclusive one-on-one interview with Premier Jason Kenney March 23rd here on Bridge City News. But in the meantime, our Premier has his own radio show, which launched in Calgary and Edmonton.
Yeah, a bit of a strange one when the press release came out to all of us, and we're like, oh, what the heck is going on here? So it's a call-in show. So over the pandemic, the Premier had done these Facebook Lives quite often where he took questions from the public, addressed misinformation, things like that. And he's now gone to the radio for this. There is some precedent for this. Apparently, Ralph Klein had a call-in radio show at one point. Not that I remember it, but it did apparently happen. And so the first episode was on Saturday. The Premier's office does not have editorial control of this. It is the two radio networks hosting it, but takes calls from the public, I guess, and then they ask him questions. So, not earth-shattering news or massive political developments, but just kind of interesting, of course, in the context of the April 9th leadership review coming up, in the context of an election year coming up in the next 8 months. Well, I guess 8 months until the year arrives, about a year until it's election time. So just very interesting in the context of those things.
But, it's pretty cool. As an Albertan, you can sit back and you can dial in and talk to the Premier. So you have questions for him. That's pretty cool. Tyler, the UCP is poised to have another fight with healthcare workers. The Health Sciences Association of Alberta's workers have been without a contract since 2020 and haven't seen raises since, 2016?
Yeah, that's what the union says. So this is a group of healthcare workers that sort of pharmacists and speech-language pathologists, pharmacy assistants, respiratory therapists, that sort of set of healthcare workers. And so they're basically asking for raises over the next 4 years, of 2%, 3%, 4% raises over those years. And AHS countered with wage cuts was their sort of responding offer. So you can see this as the early opening negotiation fight. But, they've asked for at the highest, I think about an 11% wage cut. They want a 5% wage cut for pharmacists, things like that, which, No one's going to be happy about a wage cut of those sizes. So perhaps this is just the opening of negotiations and they'll come to something else. But, as we saw with nurses, as we saw with doctors, this is a big political issue beyond just sort of being a union employer issue. The NDP obviously is going to side with the union on this one. There's going to be a lot of noise made about it, supporting healthcare, public-private healthcare, all this stuff. And of course, again, in the context of an election coming up in a year, this sort of where they're fighting with healthcare heroes is very, very crucial to the NDP's attack on the United Conservatives right now. So it's going to be quite interesting to see where that contract goes, where the politics of that goes in the months ahead.
Yeah, we'll see how this plays out, definitely. The Alberta correspondent with the National Post and our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson. Thanks for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.
Well, the world continues to watch the military invasion of Ukraine, wondering if some sort of peace pact can be arranged or if this will end up expanding to a much broader war involving NATO. Joining us to discuss this is Dr. Christian Leuprecht. He is a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Welcome to Bridge City News, Professor Leuprecht. It's so great to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be back. Thanks for having me.
Okay, absolutely. Now, many of us are wondering what is stopping Russia from having more military success? Is Russia holding back on purpose for some strategic reason, or is there really some miscommunication going on, some poor supply lines or that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's both of that is the case here. So one is that I think the Russian leadership in particular, but perhaps also the Russian military, just overestimated their capacities. Attackers often do this, and they underestimated both the capacities and the determination of the defenders. Specifically, I mean, we knew that the Russians have command and control issues, morale issues. Much of their military relies on conscript forces. So these are not usually the most motivated forces to fight. It has maintenance issues, modernization issues. And as we see, serious communication issues, both among their forces on the ground as well as between the ground forces and the Air Force. And then they have significant logistics challenges. So being able to feed your troops and keeping your vehicles fueled. And so in light of that, they've resorted to, as we know, unfortunately, shelling, because that's about the only thing that they seem to be able to do under the circumstances. But it also appears that that whole operation was just very poorly planned and even more poorly executed. And so I think it shows that we just can't take, I think one of the mistakes we made in the run up to this is we pointed to these hundreds of thousands of Russian troops, and we kind of bought into that this is this amazing fighting machine. And people like me always point out, this is not the Soviet army. So, let's just see how they actually perform. And I think they've performed even worse than people like myself had anticipated.
Well, I'm just curious now, with all these challenges that you're mentioning, how far do you think they'll be able to advance? Do you think that they'll actually be able to, maintain what Putin's desire was?
Well, so that requires us to actually first determine what was Putin trying to achieve. And I think he had 4 objectives, political objectives. So remember that the military operation is a means to an end. So the first is regime change in Kiev. And clearly the Ukrainians have denied him that. And if they can continue to hold Kiev, I think that will be a significant turning point in the war. But it would also, I think, then pose an existential risk to the continuity of the Putin regime. The second was to reduce Ukraine basically to the status of a demilitarized republic. So of the status that it had under the Soviet Union as one of the 27 republics. He's failed on that as well. He was trying to divide NATO and the European Union. Well, they've come together like no one had anticipated. So he's failed at that. And he was trying to reduce the U.S. influence in Europe and push the Americans out of Europe and undo the post-Cold War security architecture. And he has failed at that utterly and completely as well. So now the question needs to be on the military operation. What are you actually trying to achieve? If you can't actually get any of the political aims that you had, without now calling the Putin regime delegitimizing his own regime by virtue of the underperformance of his military. And so the concern here is that the Russians will double down on significant violence towards civilians in order to achieve their objective, in particular in taking Kiev. And this is part and parcel of Russian military doctrine, gross human rights violations. If you look at Africa, you look at Aleppo, you look at Chechnya, and you had asked earlier about Russian capacities. The one significant capacity outside of tactical or strategic nuclear weapons the Russians have not yet deployed is their strategic bombing force. And that's, I think, what the Ukrainians are concerned about when they ask for a no-fly zone.
It's so scary. And, you know, some are speculating, too, that Russia could start to use heavy artillery and just start destroying cities such as they did in Syria. So how likely do you think that this is, and how effective would it be?
Well, I think this is what we're seeing. So the Russians in the first 3 or so days of the invasion ran against their own military doctrine and deployed largely light infantry. And that light infantry was completely defeated by the Ukrainians. And so the Russians now literally don't have enough soldiers to take all these cities. So the only option they have is to try to subjugate the cities with artillery and with airstrikes, and by trying to encircle them and besiege them. So the Russians now have a real problem because they don't have the instruments to achieve what they actually wanted to on these cities. And so, as you point out, I think we're going to see even more shelling than we have previously. But when people call for a no-fly zone to kind of to limit the humanitarian catastrophe that we're seeing, they're forgetting that the bulk of the destruction on the ground is being wreaked by artillery and by tank shells, not from the air.
Yeah, good point. And of course, Putin has put his nuclear forces on high alert. And as we've seen that he's shelled a nuclear power plant in Ukraine. So is this just intimidation, or is it possible that he would actually use nukes?
Well, so the power plant, I think, was sort of an incidental target in the sense that Russian forces, it was sort of on the way of where Russian forces were headed. Plus, it gives them significant control over the power supply of much of the industrial and population heartland of eastern Ukraine. When we talk about the nuclear option, it's not exactly clear what Putin was trying to achieve here, because we haven't actually observed any change in the posture, in nuclear posture by the Russians. It might have simply been to draw a red line and make sure NATO stays out of Ukraine, including no-fly zone. It might have been just a Russian military doctrine. So the US, for instance, put its nuclear forces on a high alert after 9/11, just as a matter of precaution. It might very well be that he intends to use tactical nuclear weapons on the Ukrainian battlefield if he can achieve his objectives by conventional force. Or it might be that we have a lunatic in the Kremlin who's willing to do whatever it takes to achieve his objectives. And if it becomes an existential threat to him, then he'd rather destroy the world and have everybody go down together than him being decapitated by his own people.
Yeah,
so
I was just going to ask you about that since you mentioned lunatic. Of course, everyone's speculating about his mental health, so possibly his physical health, right? So is there any truth to this, that Putin's either mentally ill or terminally ill and therefore wants to make a name for himself before he dies? Kind of like you said, you can kind of go out in a big legacy, I guess. In his mind, it would be a legacy.
Yeah, so certainly Ukraine is about him establishing a legacy for himself. Right? If you watched that curious speech 2.5 weeks ago on the Monday night, where he basically said that Lenin and Stalin were wrong in granting the status of a republic to Ukraine in the first place, he's clearly trying to put himself historically above Lenin or Stalin. He wants to be seen as this great historical leader who somehow restored Russian glory. So there's certainly a bit of the megalomaniac within him. What his mental health is, so there's broad agreement among analysts that the Putin we have today is not the Putin we had 2 years ago, that he has changed significantly over the last 2 years. The Putin we had previously was always a very calculated, rational choice risk taker, pushing the envelope as far as he could, but not pushing over the edge. And it seems on this operation, he appears not to have listened either to his advisors, or the advisors he had are all yes men that are telling him what he wants to hear, because they probably believe the same sort of deranged, dysfunctional worldview that he has. But Marco Rubio, so the senior serving senator on the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, 10 days ago made an interesting remark that he basically said that after having been briefed by the CIA, there's something going on with Putin that we can't tell you. So it appears that there may also be more going on than meets the eye when it comes to Putin's ability to make decisions, let alone make rational or sensible decisions.
Mm-hmm. This may be really far off, but is there any thought to the fact that because the U.S. changed administration, that Putin now feels like he can be more brazen about stuff? Would he do this if Donald Trump were in office? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really great question. So certainly after the disastrous drawdown in Afghanistan by U.S. forces, Putin certainly felt that there was a significant moment of weakness, both by the United States and within the Western alliance. So it certainly emboldened him. And he certainly sensed that Biden was vulnerable domestically. And I think did not anticipate the extent to which the Russian invasion would bring out the Cold War warrior in President Biden, who, of course, spent a couple of decades under the Cold War. So he knows all about political, economic, and military containment of Russia. The Trump question is really interesting, too, because there's a sense, of course, that Biden was able to bring the Western alliance together because he has sort of a more multilateral approach. Make no mistake, American foreign policy is always about unilateralism. It's just with Trump, it's unilateralism with a frown. With Biden, it's unilateralism with a smile. It's still U.S. unilateralism, but it's sort of the smile of trying to get everybody together and to do things together. It's an interesting question of the extent to which Trump would have been able to be the same sort of unifying force within NATO and with the European Union. But there is a Trump silver lining in all this. So if you look at how much European countries, first and foremost Germany, have now reinvested in defense. I mean, undoing decades of defense policy, increasing defense spending by 50% overnight, or at least promising to do so. The chancellor still has to get this through parliament, let alone his own party. That suggests that there's also, I think, a cognizance by Europeans that the Americans are not the reliable partner they once were. And so that it's increasingly important for Europe to look after its own affairs and its own neighborhood. And clearly, if nothing else, the invasion of Ukraine showed just how over-reliant European allies are on American support when push comes to shove.
Wow, interesting. Very much so. Now, with peace talks continuing, some are saying that perhaps a pledge from Ukraine to stay out of NATO and to demilitarize would possibly bring an end to the fighting. What are your thoughts on that?
So this goes back to comments made by George Kennan in the 1990s when Bill Clinton started with NATO enlargement. George Kennan, of course, the famous U.S. ambassador that basically called out the Cold War and developed the whole strategy of containment. And he made the comments at the time that NATO enlargement would be a red line for the Russians. And the Russians then felt betrayed by the West in areas such as Kosovo, in Libya. In 2007, you get the turn at the Munich Security Conference by Putin pivoting to this much more aggressive posture towards the US. In 2008, you get George W. Bush then basically offering Ukraine and Georgia membership in NATO, but without laying out a pathway. And I think that's when it sort of became really a red line for the Russians. So you can argue, and people like Michael O'Hanlon, for instance, in his most recent book, have argued that we could have avoided all this if we had just said to the Americans that Ukraine and Georgia are just never going to join NATO, and that'll be the end of that. At the same time, why should the Western democratic world let itself be extorted by a bully? Why should countries not be able to make their own sovereign decisions, whether they're going to orient themselves eastward towards Moscow or westward towards Europe and Washington? Why should they be constrained in their ability to make those decisions? Is it not part and parcel of the international world order that sovereignty means you make those decisions? And what Putin is showing is that he has complete disregard for country sovereignty, not just Ukraine, but he doesn't even treat European countries as real, genuine partners. He feels that the only people that need to be taken seriously in world affairs are other superpowers, first and foremost among them Russia, the United States. So which is why Russia and Putin always said, we're going to negotiate the future of Ukraine, the future of Europe, bilaterally with Washington, basically cutting European states out altogether. And so I think it's important to demonstrate that sovereignty actually matters. And territorial integrity has been the fundamental principle of keeping Europe stable, prosperous, harmonious since the end of the Second World War. And Putin has fundamentally violated that principle, and he has done so repeatedly. And I think it's important to send a message that we simply can't condone this sort of behavior, because certainly I don't, and I think nobody in the West really wants to go back to the sort of might is right world that we had in the first half of the 20th century, because we know what humanitarian, political, social, and economic catastrophe that brought upon us.
Wow, it looks like we are out of time, but thanks so much for your expertise today, Dr. Christian Leuprecht. It's great to have you on. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Dr. Christian Leuprecht is a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.